All right, so good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good night. I'm not sure what time of the day it is anymore. So I guess before we begin, I think there's also one moment that we also have to bring forward that yesterday was the 16th, 17th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre that happened in 1989. And that the continuation of violence, particularly against violence against women in precarious positions, continue. As we take a time to remember that, we also have to remember women like Zali Zhang, who was a sex trade worker from Hamilton, who was just recently murdered. Person who was non-status and who was trying to survive here in Canada, but because of our immigration laws and because the exploitative and dangerous conditions associated with sex work was murdered. So when we think about violence and attacks against our sisters, we always have to remember how vulnerabilities and how precariousness leads to that. So I just wanted to start off by that. The second thing, I guess, in every talk that Justicia does, we always remember people who've died, people who have been sent home, and people who are no longer here because of the structures of the programs. And we do this to provide a human face, but also to show part of the narrative of what organizing resistance is. And I guess I'm honored and proud to acknowledge the people in the room that are joining us today from Justicia for Migrant Workers. And the reason why I'm doing this is also to show this collective story of resistance. So it's not the idea of just saying, hey, this guy's here, that guy's here, but to show how those individual and collective forms of struggle lead to some of the kernels of what we need to do in strengthening the labor movement and strengthening the on-the-ground forms of resistance. So the first is Alberto. And Alberto was a migrant worker from the southwestern Windsor area. And Alberto was one of the first workers to actually stand up around health and safety conditions in this workplace. And for standing up for those rights, he was terminated. He fought back, and he's recently come to a resolution of that issue. But your courage is extremely important in the work that's going on. Next to him is Sazna, who actually I'm quite amazed that you're here. Sazna is one of the most important organizers in Toronto. And her work, I guess, is one of those people that just kind of does work and doesn't get the recognition or credit sometimes that she deserves, but she's phenomenal, she's smart, she's articulate, and she's tough as nails. So definitely that your work's important. Thank you so much for that. Next to Sazna is Winston Morrison. And Winston's also indicative of our temporary foreign worker programs. Winston was an active worker also from the Kingsville, Leamington area. And he suffered a workplace accident. And we'd gone to try to talk to him beforehand, before he'd left for his injury. And we were trying to say, look, let's find a way for you to stay in Canada. Let's try to find a way to continue getting you medical care in Canada. Winston at that time, not sure what's going to happen, went home. He came back, his condition with his leg got worse, and they flew him back here to Canada to have his leg amputated. And Winston, I guess, is committed now. He's been taking on workers' compensation. He's struggling to fight against both the governments of Canada and Jamaica, but he's also trying to let other workers know about the obstacles and the obstacles that lead to migrant worker programs and the frustrations that workers that they face. So he's been there to try to fight with them. Ken Roy, who's going to be joining us in a bit, is also another worker who they tried to send home after suffering another workplace accident. So he'll be with us in a few minutes. Anna Liu, who's right there, who's been an amazing organizer overall and has provided a lot of support for us. And Jessica Frias, one of the founders. Evelyn, and Tran has done important work with Public Service Alliance in supporting us. So part of the conversation of why this is happening today is that there's been a frustration, I think, from a lot of community activists around the way that migrant workers have been positioned, particularly with the two so-called exceptions of HD mining and RBC. And the response from, I guess, the general community, right, and I guess it's no surprise that some of our labor comrades have taken the same position, was to repeat history. And to prove my point, I took two quotes, one from the BC Federationist, and then two comments recently. So from 97, 98 years ago, it's been proved time and time again that when the Oriental gets a foothold in a certain line, the standard of wage in the field at once drops because of his basing his wage demands according to his standard of living. It is not a case of possible raising the Oriental to the white standard. It is a case of the certain lowering of the standards of the whites. Okay? Fast forwarded 97, 98 years later. Primarily, we want to make sure our Canadian standards Safety standards that we fought for long periods of time are upheld, and that we managed to grow and build the safety standards and the work opportunity for Canadians. The same union activists. This, meaning bringing migrant workers, is going to lower the standards of living for Canadians and Canadian jobs. So one of the reasons why Justicia, and Justicia are all volunteers, we're activists on weekends and evenings who go out and try to work with different workers and try to build and to try to fight this idea that migrant workers are taking away Canadian jobs. Part of the work that we do is try to forge multiracial alliances and get workers from different communities and Canadian workers together to try to understand and try to fight together. And about 100 years ago as well, W.B. Du Bois, as many of us know, talked about a conversation about how race and the color line was a fundamental pillar of the barrier in American society. I think 100 years later, for us as Canadians, race has to be looked at interwoven with the immigration question. And this inability of labor, of the community and the Canadian population in general to address, to grapple, and to move and forge forward. And what that means is we're still in this position that some people are having entitlements and benefits as opposed to others. The idea of building on this notion of exclusion. So solidarity is based on exclusion and not in trying to see how do we expand benefits, how do we expand rights for all in our society. So I think one of the first challenges that we come across and what we try to forge ahead is trying to fight divide and rule. Trying to contextualize what the history of racism has been to the labor movement and to workers in general. How do we begin to start talking about race and class and that intersection? And understanding the positions of immigration, how immigration denies people abilities of rights. So part of those larger questions is what guides us into the work that we're doing on the ground. And this comes from some of the community work that's been going on. And just to highlight, so there's been a lot of community, there's been some political, there's been some legal stuff. So the community, some of the most current issues that are going on, and many of you have probably seen stuff through the Socialist Project or the Workers' Assembly, is that in the community of Leamington, Ontario, the mayor recently made comments saying that black men are harassing white women, particularly Jamaican men. And the mayor of the town had proposed a bylaw to try to ban migrant workers from congregating downtown. And why this was important in addressing as a community issue and as a labor issue is first, this historical context of this racialized other, right, which is extremely important in the creation of the farm worker program, but also how racialized bodies have been treated throughout our history. We wanted to point out what that meant. We wanted to show also the connection that there is a attempt by the community of Leamington to gentrify the downtown core. Right? So downtown is where all the migrant workers hang out. And they want to basically push all the migrant workers outside, build up the wealth of the downtown core, and have the migrant workers further hidden. So on one side, the Financial Post will talk about how Leamington is one of the most growing communities in its category of communities, right? Through the growth of the greenhouse industry. But the contributions that migrant workers provide to the community are being pushed to the side. So what we're trying to encourage in that community is for workers of all, from unionized workers in Leamington and Windsor, as well as the migrant workers to come together and to fight this, right? And make sure that this is stopped when it does come. The Heinz situation, so the first we talk about community, the second we'll talk about the invisibility, right? When part of the work is bringing forward issues. So we've talked about Heinz, right? Everybody knows about the disaster of Heinz and the United Food and Commercial Worker jobs, that 1,000 jobs are going to be lost. But there's another 1,500 jobs of migrant agricultural workers and Canadian agricultural workers who are going to be lost as a result of this plant as well too. And there's been absolutely no support provided to any of these workers. So part of it's also trying to expose that, trying to make sure that those voices are not lost, and to bring those issues to the forefront. And the third issue, I think, is that looking at, I guess, the future. What does the future hold? About 2009? 2009, we had a 12-hour march from Leamington, Ontario to Windsor. Okay? 2010. Well, it's going to be 4 years. So in 2010, we had a 12-hour march from Leamington to Windsor. And it was organized predominantly by a group of Thai and Filipino women. And these women were fed up and angered about the paying of recruitment fees, which the Liberals just apparently addressed somewhat. They were concerned about housing issues, the control that the employers and recruiters were having on their lives. and the racism and sexism they're facing in the community. So this group of women, who were joined by Caribbean and Guatemalan and Mexican migrant workers, decided to do a 12-hour march. And generally, people knew about this, right? It wasn't a secret. It was extremely powerful action. But our labor comrades weren't there to greet us. And there was this total silence of wanting to address that issue. Because this was seen as a threat to who, for God knows who knows why. But it was seen as a threat. It was seen as something that wasn't part of the community. The action took place. I think it was one of the most historic actions. It shows the forms of resistance that workers are willing to take on. I think in the future going forward, we have to look at the experiences, understand that workers have to have the space of self-organizing. They have the ability for us all to understand the resistance that they're taking. And to show solidarity, it means talking about expansion of rights. So talking about our pensions, talking about OAS, talking about EI, and the ability of benefits to be available anywhere. Idea of status and citizenship, to ensure that people are coming to Canada, if they're so-called good enough to work, then they should have the ability to stay here in Canada. People should not be facing reprisals for standing up for their work. People should have the ability to work wherever they want. And of course, the most important thing is to ensure there's democracy in the workplaces. And this could only happen through collective bargaining and organizing in a way that workers' voices are coming forward. So I think these are some of the ways to go forward. We started out by talking about Du Bois and Du Bois' challenge of understanding racism and how racism pits workers against each other. His call and his demand and his plea for a question and for us to respond to that hasn't been met yet. We continue to grapple with this issue, and it's finding ways for us to take this on forward and to make sure we don't make the mistakes that we've made in the past. Thank you.
And our final speaker is Herman.
Thanks. You know, one of the first times I got to know Chris was I was writing a course in the CAW, and part of it was about migrant workers. And I asked Chris, could we talk about migrant workers? He says, yeah, we could, but he says, that's not where we should be doing. So he brought me down to, I think it was Simcoe.
Yeah.
We spent a few hours, actually 3 or 4 hours there, getting to talk to people, seeing what they do, watching people waiting in line to use the telephones. I mean, the whole gamut, and it says a lot about the kind of work that Chris does. So the forces, as Evelyn was mentioning, the forces that drive global migration are the same forces that drive the attacks on organized working class people everywhere, and they're not new. Including here in the Global South, they both challenge and shape limits and openings, neoliberal globalization, free movement of capital, state enforcement of the power of global capital within nation states and across, attacks on limits to the operation of private accumulation that drives people to move across borders and within borders, dispossession of people on the land, but also people with previously secure jobs. The creation of a working class and a more dependent working class is an ongoing feature of capitalism itself. It is going on constantly, even if it's intensifying in particular ways now. The increase in precarity is often and erroneously identified in the minds of many trade unionists with those who are the greatest victims and targets of it, even though we know that 52% of working people live with some form of precarity now, especially the young. This encourages a kind of blaming approach mixed with fear of losing one's security and place in the job market. Practices and laws initiated by the government to take advantage of the precarity of global migrants, we mentioned some of them, and deregulated labor markets such as the temporary foreign worker program, live-in caregiver program, outsourcing, offshoring are always used as wedges, and not just as in terms of material ways of exploitation. How unions respond to this set of challenges is critical. Do we see these as an opportunity to build solidarity and support for co-workers and co-victims of a similar system, or as competitors? When do we call for those currently living in Canada to fill these jobs instead of others from other countries? When is that exclusionary? How do we respond to the laws and practices that I described? Do we oppose them and welcome workers from abroad as full members of our civil and political communities with full rights? And how do we oppose them? In statements, there's a lot of statements about them recently, or in real educational, participatory, and mobilizational forums. And what would that mean? Do we call for those who have been brought in to work in these circumstances to be sent home as the solution, or to be welcome here as part of our movement, given the choice of what to do, where to live, where to work, and how to organize? How do we relate to those workers who the state deems as, quote, illegal immigrants? Are they to be accepted as part of our working class, or persecuted and seen as threat to, quote, our livelihoods? How do we build support and understanding of these issues within our unions and communities, given that people feel insecure? Posed this way isn't much of a challenge, they're more rhetorical questions than anything else. But it becomes more challenging when we ask, should we have immigration rules at all? And if so, what should they be? Those are really important questions which we have to debate. There are efforts to address some of the injustices through reforms, such as campaigns for a living wage for all, organizing to ensure that there's no second-class status for anybody working in Canada, eliminating limitations on live-in caregivers' rights, and radically reforming or eliminating the TFW program, allowing all those working in Canada the same rights. I might mention right now there's 191 immigration detainees who have gone on strike in Lindsay, Ontario, and they're held in this kind of incarceration. Supporting and encouraging the work of organizations such as the Workers' Action Centre. Much of this has helped to push the Ontario government to offer legislation, but that is limited in a number of ways. It'll be interesting to see how people evaluate that. But the fact that they've been forced to raise it says something. We have to identify those limitations and push to correct them. More, we need to develop clear programs of reforms and take them up. But no political campaigns have really been taken up at all, really, from the labor movement, let alone these. Organizing people with joint planning, like unions collaborating instead of competing to see who's going to get new members. Like what's happening right now, it seems to be happening around the work that happened in precarious work and service industries and that sort of thing in the U.S. But just recently, last week, there was an experience of Filipino workers in Tim Hortons and Denny's in the Philippines in BC. We need to collectively argue that the trade union movement has to take this up as a priority and actually organize rather than saying my union's better than yours and I'm going to compete to see who's going to join them. Meanwhile, nobody gets organized. In a larger sense, though, we must also argue for limits on the power and operation of neoliberalism itself. No one's really saying that anywhere. And a move towards different kinds of forms of economic development with all nation states and regions having the right to be able to develop this way. It means fighting to control the nature and direction of investment, controlling jobs, limiting markets, and eliminating the multi-tiered pyramid of rights for different kinds of workers that exists in labor markets around the world today. And fighting not just to do this here, but fighting to support people fighting for that elsewhere in other countries. Because those are the critical underpinnings of what's driving the forced global migration. And it has solidaristic and collegial overtones and is tied and must be tied to an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist agenda. But challenging this requires a deeper, more left-wing perspective than is more traditional than what's around there, which says, I'd like to go back to the good old days, to the post-war era when workers had the ability to rise to the middle class. Underlined. That latter option is gone, if it ever was. Building a political understanding and a movement to challenge these larger forces is difficult, and unfortunately not on the political agendas of unions or any political parties that are around today. Obviously, there's a challenge to counter the tendency to blame and target the other, China, India, Africa, Asia, for, quote, taking our jobs, and arguing for a contest and conflict with the working classes and peoples of the global south. It has racist and nativist overtones, and fighting against outsourcing has to be seen in the context of developing capacities here and supporting the development of capacities elsewhere, which is a different kind of way of looking at things. So just in general, finally, how issues of these kinds are posed reflects real important challenges. Well, I keep on thinking what happened with the RBC, because that was a moment we all sort of was out there. Everybody was talking about it. And I remember we talked a bit about it, I forget when, but while calling for an end to the rights of capital to outsource jobs to cheaper venues, unions also have to support the rights of all workers in all countries to good, secure, well-paying jobs as part of their sovereign right to enjoy the benefits of economic development, whatever that might mean, with its concomitant creation of new capacities and possibilities. Unions need to argue and mobilize to support for movements in the global south that are fighting to develop different economic models and capacities, not to seek to take advantage of differences in our respective labor markets to reinforce poverty, dependency, and lack of development. Most unions do not. Some do. I worked I did a session in an NGO in Cape Town, South Africa called ILRIG, which had this perspective, and the steelworkers actually paid for it. But unfortunately, when I was at CW, most of the time the NGOs they supported were NGOs number one and number two. They were mostly like charity cases, and they didn't have this kind of perspective at all. And you've noticed the Canadian government has gone in the other direction and now pushing further neoliberalization in terms of its foreign aid is going to be tied to it's going to help multinational capital with Canadian bases. But while opposing efforts of employers to fire workers living here and replace them with cheaper labor, unions have to be careful about how they articulate demands and how they relate to workers whom employers seek to use in these situations. There's a fine line between talking about keeping jobs of people who currently have jobs here and building resentment towards immigrant workers who are working either outside the rules, deemed illegal, or through some of the various precarious programs, such as Migrant Worker Program and TPF and those. We must respect this line and be clear about what we mean here. Different people from different origins hear and experience these kinds of comments differently than others. I noticed that around the RBC thing. The way people talked about not outsourcing jobs, it wasn't just the talk about outsourcing jobs, it was the way they talked about it. It was the way they talked about, protecting Canadian jobs, and you could tell, just there were undertones by these, and they had meetings. Different people from different origins hear and experience these kinds of comments and these approaches differently than others. Neoliberal capitalism is adept at segmenting the different components of the working class and playing us off against each other. There's a reason why activists from the migrant justice movement, precarious worker movement, and immigrant right movements were so upset about the way the RBC challenge came, and argued for considering the particular concerns of the elements of the working class that they work with. All workers working in Canada should have the same rights, the right to organize, to protest, to find useful employment. They should have a clear path to permanent residency and or citizenship, and most unions today have come to support these demands on paper. But with unions, activists who work on these issues need to have a collective voice and should play a role in the educational work of these unions. It needs to become part of the larger transformation of our unions, away from simply representing particular groups of workers and bargaining with particular employers, but as instruments of representing the interests of the entire working class. These concerns should be a key element in our opposition to the ongoing orgy of attacks against the rights of all workers in Canada. Whether they involve outsourcing work, lowering wages, benefits, and job security, undermining the quality of jobs, or using programs like the Temporary Foreign Worker Program to punish and abuse workers from other countries, mainly from the Global South. We must stand up for equality, dignity, and the rights of working people.